I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. This is true oral storytelling. I write each episode myself, and then, like the Scandinavian bards known as skalds, I perform them in one single, flawless take. SKALD is serialized, but every episode is a great jumping on point, especially this one. After listening, if you want some backstory, check out the previous episodes of the podcast or pick up the prose volumes on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 65. The centaurs had increased their ranging. Season after season, year after year, generation after generation, those wild man-horse hybrids drew closer and closer, harrying the very edges of the civilized world, trampling the works of their more purebred cousins beneath their hooved feet, smashing into the walls over and over again until finally those impregnable barriers broke under the unceasing pressure, allowing the wild centaurs to flood into areas tamed decades earlier, areas that had been developed, refined, civilized. They pushed back the boundaries of man. They pushed back the boundaries of civilization. They pushed back the boundaries of the mighty, heaving city of Ravenna. They didn't do it without a fight. The boundaries of Ravenna were shrinking, pulling back, taking a stronger stance, a position that could be more easily defended. The marshalling of forces, strategic retreats, and in some regrettable cases, outright routs. The once great city of Ravenna, the once great city-state of Ravenna, the one that stretched and sprawled across that border realm with only one thing giving it pause, only one terrible, unspeakable abomination keeping it in check. It fought to maintain its shrinking borders, to maintain its relevance and its power. And that fight, it required considerable resources. So as the city, what was left of it, placed all its efforts into maintaining what had been built, maintaining what had been carved out of the unforgiving wilderness, as it repurposed proctors and guards, as it spent time and money to reinforce walls, to counter attacks, to send scouts into centaur-controlled territory, those tangled, dense forests that sprouted up far too quickly wherever civilization ceded control. As Ravenna made defense from without a priority, a pernicious, inevitable decay took root within. And while Ravenna's eyes were elsewhere, while it was too busy staring at the horizon to detect the seething infection growing in its own gut, that was when they went to work. The followers, the adherents, the zealots. She shifted her weight slightly, enough to take the pressure off her hip, but not enough to risk detection, not enough to rustle the heavy canopy upon which she laid, her head peeking up just slightly over the edge. She had stationed herself in the bazaar, stationed herself exactly where he had directed her, where he had commanded her to go, summoning up his most fearsome aspect. And there she watched, patiently, eagerly, looking down upon the square of remembrance. The vendors and merchants, the speculators and chiselers, she watched them all with sharp, beady eyes, the eyes of a rat accustomed to living underfoot, the eyes of a vermin. The square was devoid of flora. Not a single plant sprouted up from those shattered pavers, the ones that were left in a state of perpetual disrepair, a reminder of she did not know what. She wasn't privileged enough to have learned that city's history, because what place was a classroom for one such as her? For vermin. Though the border realm's dual suns shone down unhindered upon those torn and broken stones, upon the mounds of earth where something massive, something powerful, something significant had been uprooted, though no plant or tree or weed rose up to worship those twin gods of light, the bazaar's customers did not traverse that market alone. No, amongst them, rising up from the earth like a mockery of natural growth, a nod toward the artificial nature of Ravenna and the ugliness that sprouted forth from it, the disease and pestilence that it would ever spawn, would ever need to root out, to burn out with cleansing flame, standing there insolently, an affront to all that was good and noble and decent, were the statues. Though their features had been dulled and worn away by decades of wind and rain, of sun and of snow, not even nature itself could wipe their hideousness away. Their grotesquerie shined through, and what's more, was acknowledged as a type of quirk, one that Ravenna's more joyous citizens juxtaposed with the floral wreaths and crowns that festooned those figures. Her lip rose in an instinctive sneer. It was typical. It was so typical of Ravenna and her children. When confronted with ugliness, when faced with the horror of what they had wrought, with the teeming masses of people just like her, the masses of vermin that had been discarded and forgotten. What did they do? What action did they take? Coated it with flowers, and they went about their day, buying, selling, passing the time until they themselves fell into that inky black void. Nothingness. But as much as it pained her, as much as it infuriated her, as much as she wanted to burn that entire city to the ground, to give it over to him, to the only one who deserved it, the only one who could lead them, she could not. She had her orders. He knew what was best. His plan was flawless, perfect, and he had given her so much in order to pull it off just as he planned. No, she would stick with the plan. She would obey his orders. She served the vermin prince. But she was no longer content with scraps. So she watched. She waited. She waited until her fellow faithful, her fellow adherents, her fellow zealots sprang into action. They descended upon the square from gutter and from alley, from beggar's stoop and from indigent's corner. They fell upon that market, the one that attempted to cover up the ugliness, to cover up the truth, to cover up the festering core of Ravenna with flowers, with trinkets, with baubles, and with the ephemeral pleasures of wealth, with the illusion of freedom. And as they did, she watched, and she waited. She watched as that filthy, riotous horde, disciplined in its unruliness, regimented in its chaos, watched as they set upon the stalls and the tables, set upon the caravans and the ornate, richly appointed displays. She watched as the Vermin Prince's army lashed out in riotous spasms, stealing, breaking, smashing the delicate social order upon which Ravenna had been built. She watched those zealots, one's hand selected by her master, by her leader, by her idol, the Vermin Prince, the ones fast enough to give a good chase, but slow enough not to completely disappear. The ones that the movement, that the cause could do without, and the ones that were capable of maneuvering their own way out of trouble. She watched them swarm the square. She watched with a grin as their hands smeared filth over the merchant's finery. She watched. She waited. She waited for her signal. The sign that she should spring into action, that she should pursue her part of the Vermin Prince's exquisite, flawless plan. She waited the proctors to arrive. She waited for what remained of the proctors to arrive. Those that through luck, old age, ineptitude, nepotism, or simple circumstance have been denied the opportunity to go to the front, denied the opportunity to contribute to the fight Ravenna thought most important, denied the chance to monitor and to defend Ravenna's shrinking borders, and instead, they were condemned to stay here in Ravenna's rotting core, condemned to keep them, to keep the vermin at bay. And sure enough, in mere moments, in an instant, the growing mass of vermin, a horde that consisted of the Vermin Prince's faithful as well as others, those who knew themselves to be vermin and hid it, and, most dangerously, those that thought themselves incorrectly to be above their fellows. In an instant, they were joined by the flowing black cloaks, by the scowling faces, by the rising and falling clubs. They were joined by the proctors. And as those clubs rose and fell over and over again, she, the Vermin Prince's chosen thief, rose. And she launched herself into action. With the proctors distracted, with a chance to indulge their worst, purest, and most violent instincts, with a chance to bash the skulls of those they thought themselves better than, with a chance to debase themselves in an effort to elevate themselves. Her way was clear. Her way was clear to dart across the tops of the stalls, unnoticed by proctor and by merchant, to leap through the air, to fling herself out into the void, with no regard for her safety or what came next, trusting in the simple truth that even if nothing caught her, even if she could not catch herself, it would be no worse than what she leapt from. Something did catch her. She did catch herself. She caught herself on the stony edifice of that nearby building, the one inhabited by those rich enough to raise themselves up from the streets, from the gutters, from the very sewers that had given rise to her and her kind. She clung to the side of that building relentlessly, tenaciously, like the vermin that she was, like the vermin that they had forced her and her kind to become. She hung there for an imperceptible imperceptible instant, allowing her muscles a moment of rest before they contracted and pulled, before she heaved herself up on top of the building, still unseen by those below, too accustomed to looking down, too beaten down to have the temerity to look up to the sky, across which a lithe, dirty figure now darted. The proctors were busy. Their attention was elsewhere. That was true. But the distraction caused by her fellow zealots was only momentary. It would soon fade, and upon returning to their posts, the proctors would find her, and, if she was lucky, they would kill her themselves. Time was of the essence. Time was all she truly possessed, and she had so very little of it. She leapt from building to building, making her way quickly, carefully, toward the tower. The tower that sat at the center of Ravenna, the center of the city and the center of the city-state when it was at its height, when it was at its strongest, in those golden days, in the halcyon days of Ravenna's previous existence, when everyone had work, when everyone had purpose. That tower had risen impossibly high, high enough so that it could see all the way to each of Ravenna's constantly expanding borders. And as Ravenna had expanded, so too did that tower grow, pulling the very stones from the earth, impressing them into service as new foundations, ones which pushed the tower further and further up toward the heavens. But now that was no longer the case. Ravenna's borders had contracted, and as they had, the tower had crumbled. That gleaming, inviolable obelisk had fallen into disrepair, that towering testament to Ravenna's greatness, the one buffeted by glorious magics that had all but left the city. It had fallen, and it continued to fall as Ravenna's borders fell in upon themselves. But the crumbling stones of the tower, they made it easier to climb, far easier for one such as her, one blessed with the very essence of her master, her teacher, her idol, the Vermin Prince. And she climbed that debauched tower as her muscles ached and cried out for succor, as her hands bled from the rough stones she gripped over and over again, leaving a grisly trail of bloody handprints going up the side of the tower, as she, exhausted, climbed tirelessly, her body filled with a surge of desire. Desire to overthrow Ravenna, cast it down into the gutters, a desire to free herself from those very gutters, a desire to escape the Vermin Prince's wrath, and most of all, a desire to please him. She feared the Vermin Prince, for he was as terrible as any soul that drew breath within Ravenna. She hated him for his violence, for his brutality, for his merciless nature, for his terror, for his violence, for his brutality and mercilessness. She also loved him. She loved that which she feared and that which she hated, because it was those traits and those traits alone that made his dream possible, that made his future, her future, their future possible. As though she feared his powers, his limitless, frightening powers, she also revered them, as he had bestowed upon her his inimitable blessing. She and the rest of his followers, his adherents, his zealots, they knew what they were. They knew what they had been transformed into, what they had become. They knew that they were vermin, nothing more, nothing less, and they leaned into it. They owned their destitution, their misery, their impotence. They relished their place in the gutters, the alleys, and the sewers. They embraced that which was worse than themselves, and the vermin prince, he did so more than all the others, because it was through him that they learned the richness of their destitution, the pleasure in their misery, and the power in their impotence. They served the vermin prince. They were no longer content with scraps. So they looked to the gutters, the alleys, and the sewers. They looked down. They looked to those that were as debased, as filthy, and unwanted as themselves. They looked to the vermin, to the rats, and to the insects, those that crept and crawled, those that lived only in utter filth and atavistic nightmares, the nameless fears that haunt the ancestral dreams of even the mightiest warriors. Through the vermin prince, through his teachings and catechisms, they found that which was most verminous. They found it in others, and they found it in themselves. She had found it in herself. He had shown it to her, and now she used it to scramble up the tower with strength, with speed, with stealth that could not belong to a human. She pulled herself through the window of that tower's highest room. Upon entering the room, that unnaturally dark chamber, she fell instinctively to her belly. Hands and feet sprawled out across the smooth, cold stones, flattening herself to the ground like the vermin from which she drew her power. Her eyes had yet to adjust, but she had no time to allow them. And besides, she had memorized the room's layout. She had committed to memory the scratchy, amateurish map created by one of her fellow zealots, the one who had worked a lifetime to earn the right to serve in the tower, but had never forgotten where his loyalties truly laid. So as her pupils grew, as they let in more and more of the scant light that made it into that sepulchral tower, she scuttled across the floor, breathing shallowly so as not to raise her body any higher than was utterly necessary. She made her way to the altar. It was gleaming black, blacker than black, so black that it drew light into it, never to be released. Perhaps this was the source of the room's nigh impenetrable darkness. The altar was black, distressingly black. But as she drew nearer, she also saw something else in that sickening stone. Veins. Red veins that wove through that haunting marble, pulsing and quivering with an eldritch power that she did not know, could not know, and that she wished to forget as soon as she laid eyes upon it. But she continued staring. She continued searching, and soon enough, she found it. Hanging in the darkness, suspended by the very shadows themselves, the ones that rose menacingly and impossibly up from the altar itself, spinning slowly in an impudent mockery of the very laws of nature themselves. She saw it, that dread, gleaming, fell weapon, the one that she had been sent for, the one she had been sent to retrieve, the one she was meant to obtain for the vermin prince, he who had given her everything and would give her more still, give it to her as well as all of his zealots, if she could but lay her hands upon that hateful, blackened spear. Still crawling, dragging herself across the floor, she began to rise, slowly, hesitantly, humbled in the presence of such an unbelievably powerful artifact, a weapon that could change the course of history itself, a weapon that, if placed in the filthy, shaking hands of her idol, the vermin prince, could change the world. But suddenly, she stopped, as her ears were assaulted by a sound that was heinously out of place, a sound that should not have been there, but was there nonetheless. A cough. She whirled around, raising herself into a crouch, a position that minimized her as a target, that gave her the flexibility to lash out with hand, with foot, or with tooth, fighting with all she had at her disposal, like the vermin that swarmed her home, that filled her very soul. She turned, her lips raised in a sneer, a hiss rising up in her throat, and she found herself confronted with a twisted, wryly grinning crone. The old woman was bent and hunched, gnarled by age and necessary decisions reluctantly made. She had more wrinkles than skin, and she looked to be at least 100 years old if she was even a day. She could barely walk. She couldn't even stand without that ancient staff. It was as gnarled as she was, but with a gleaming, smoky, giant pearl placed atop of it. The crone was ancient, defenseless, and by the look of her, more than half mad. But that didn't stop the zealot, who launched herself at this interloper, forcing her back down upon the floor in an explosion of dust, one that seemed to come not from the spotless floor, but from the crone's robes and wrinkles. She was desperate to silence the old woman, to stop her before she alerted anyone else, to do it quickly, before the proctors began to return to their posts, so she moved her hands deftly to the crone's throat. Frantically, she wrapped her hands around the crone's wrinkled neck, her long, squalid nails fighting through the wrinkled flesh, searching for the windpipe that she would squeeze and crush quickly, efficiently, mercilessly. And as she did so, she whispered softly, whispered that magical phrase, the one taught to all of his followers, to all of his adherents, to all of his zealots. I serve the vermin prince, but I am no longer content with scraps. She spoke the words proudly, but as she looked expectantly to the crone, eager to see her eyes grow wide in terror, in the fear that took all those who found themselves in the vermin prince's sights, she was shocked, horrified, and frightened to see that the crone merely laughed. "Why are you laughing? Tell me!" the girl hissed, her anger and her curiosity getting the best of her. "Are you so eager to die? Is death so funny to you?" The crone tears in her eyes, not from pain, but from laughter. Shook her head slowly, slightly, shook it as much as she could manage. No, no, my girl. It's just my pet. She hasn't eaten yet today. In that ever so brief moment of confusion, the crone licked her dry, cracked lips. She pursed them together tightly, and she let out a whistle, a noise that was painfully shrill and shockingly loud. It was the last thing the girl ever heard. SKALD is completely DIY, which means that I rely on you, the SKALD fan base, to help me with advertising, getting the word out about SKALD, and even covering the costs of doing the show. More on that in a minute. But some people, some SKALD fans, go above and beyond. One of these people is my pal, Baker. Not only is he a big fan of SKALD, but he is an amazing artist and the dude behind SKALD's amazing, brutal new album art and the cover for SKALD, the One True Collection, Volume 1. More on that in a minute, too. Please, go tell him how rad a job he did and give him a follow on Instagram at Cover Your Ears, Kids. Fuck you, Baker. And to buy his rad shirts, flags, patches, and pins, head to bakerxdewolk.com. That's BakerXdewolk.com. Remember earlier when I said something about covering the cost of the show? Well, even if you aren't as artistically gifted as Baker, you can still chip in and help make sure SKALD can continue going strong until the day I am ushered into that inky black void of nothingness. How, you ask? By going to patreon.com/SKALD today and signing up to support the show with a small monthly donation. Every Tuesday, please talk about and plug SKALD online and in real life. This is the only way that I can get more listeners, which leads to more patrons and more SKALD. Also, make sure to hit up AubreySitterson.com for links to everything, including SKALD, my wrestling talk show Straight Shoot, my comics work, bio, contact information, and more. This week's plug is 100% a completely self-serving one. It's the aforementioned SKALD, the One True Collection, Volume 1. This single volume contains the first 3 cycles of SKALD. That's episodes 1 through 48. And you can get it all for the low, low price of $6.99. Only on Amazon. Even if you don't decide to pick it up, I hope you will. But even if you don't, please take a few moments to leave the book a good Amazon review. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.